Hello everyone, welcome to this total drama What If. The concept is pretty simple. What if Harold didn't rig the votes against Courtney in episode 12 of Total Drama Island? I believe that a lot of plot lines will change because of this. We start off in basics training where the episode plays out the same way, with the base losing the challenge so they have to go to elimination. If Harold isn't planning on rigging the votes against Duncan, I do believe that he would try and convince people to vote off Duncan for bullying him and overall being horrible to Harold. The only person I could see voting with Harold would be Bridget, but no one else would. The clear target for this elimination was Harold, and in a 4-2 vote with Duncan, so Harold would be eliminated. Episode 13 begins with Chris driving a plane that wakes up all the campers. The plot line of Gwen and Bridget finding out who the love letters are for would no longer happen since Harold got eliminated an episode before. The first part of the challenge, the skydiving challenge, will still remain the same with DJ competing for the base and Trent for the Gophers. DJ would still accidentally push Trent of the plane, causing him to miss the couch and land straight onto the ground. DJ would successfully land on the couch, then get squished inside of the coach, because of course he does, therefore 1 point to the base. Trent would then get sent to the infirmary because of his injuries. The mouse writing part of the challenge would still have the same contestants with Jeff for the base and Lashana for the Gophers. Since the plot line of Gwen and Bridget trying to find out who wrote the love letters is no longer happening, Jeff would pull down his pants and show Bridget his tattoo. This means that Jeff is actually in position to stay on the moose. I do believe that he could stay on it, since he has shown to be pretty great at challenges and he would probably want to impress Bridget, therefore scoring a point for the base. Lashana would still compete for the Gophers and ride the mouse successfully. The mud ski race would have Heather being the driver and Bridget being the skier. I believe that Bridget being a good surfer would be a skill that somewhat translates to mud skiing. Bridget would successfully capture all the flags like Harold in the original. Heather would then attempt to cut the rope with Bridget on, but then her top gets ripped off. I don't think Bridget would get distracted like Harold since Heather's a female and Bridget is also female. I imagine Bridget would just cross the finish line with all of the flags. Next is Lindsay skiing and Duncan driving. This would play out the same as the original. Lindsay would cross the finish line with all the flags with Duncan crashing off the course. This would lead to another tie which both teams receive 1 point. This then leads to the base winning 3-2 and having the shower award as well. I feel like Heather would know she at risk of elimination and would want to enact a plan. She knows that Gwen, Lashana and Trent are all voting for her, so she needs to get someone to flip. She has Lindsay's vote and Owen is seen eating marshmallows throughout the episodes and Heather would bribe him with food, similar to episode 5 in the Justin elimination. This would then cause a 3-3 tie. In Island we don't know what happens between a tie and Heather would like to avoid that. She tells Owen to tell Trent, who's still in the infirmary, that him, Gwen and Lashana are actually voting Lindsay since Heather is too good at challenges to vote of this early. This would confuse Trent, but since he is in the infirmary he can't really think straight. Trent would then agree to this plan. Come to elimination, Heather, Owen and Lindsay would all vote Trent since Heather would like to keep challenge strength up and having an injured Trent wouldn't be too good at challenges. At this point she doesn't know that the merge is coming soon. Gwen and Lashana would vote Heather and Trent would vote Lindsay. This leaves Trent being voted off and he is shocked. He asks Gwen why they didn't vote off Lindsay like the plan was, but Gwen denies that there was any plan to vote off Lindsay. Trent then looks at Heather's, who's smiling saying, "Bye-bye Trent." Owen then has an extreme look of guilt on his face. Gwen looks heartbroken, but Trent tells her to carry on and at the very least win for them. Gwen and Trent then share a kiss before Chef drags him to the boat of losers. Episode 14 would begin with the team splitting into girls and boys and moving into different cabins. In base girls' cabin Bridget wouldn't be feeling lonely since Courtney is still in the game and they would be having a pleasant conversation about their respective partners. The tension in the girls' cabin would be even worse than the original with the Trent elimination in last episode. The guy cabin would be similar to the original with Owen fitting right in with the base guys. When Heather lays down the tape and Courtney and Bridget are forced to pick new sides, I believe they would both pick Gwen and Lashana's side. Bridget did in the original and Courtney is shown to dislike Heather, and later in the season Courtney apparently told Lashana about Duncan giving a rabbit to DJ, so that must mean in friendship on some degree. When the actual challenges begins there is a gender imbalance between the teams, but I don't think Chris would change any of the girls onto the guys' teams. none of the girls appear tomboyish enough, so I think that the girls would have 6 players and the boys with 4. This would give the guys an advantage, but there's nothing Chris can really do about it. Courtney's been shown to have a strong stomach, so I think she'll do fine. The first part of the challenge is bull testicles, which the girls would still win like the original since it's criminal to do that to the guys. Jeff would still help Bridget eat the meat, which further deepens their bond. Duncan would still get mad at Jeff, but they would quickly make up. The next round is pizza with jelly sauce, anchovies and live grasshoppers. Bridget would still help Lindsay eat the pizza by doing some yogic meditation. Since Trent is eliminated and he has a weak stomach, I imagine the guys would still win, making it 1-1 points. The next dish is earthworm spaghetti. The guys would still cover their eyes and noses, which would allow them to stomach the food easier. The guys would still win since a general good strategy in real life doing that. This would make it 2-1 to the guys. The next course is soup with hanging nails. Bridget would still put the funnel in Lindsay's mouth and pour the soup down, making the girls win, making it 2-2. The next couples of rounds are quick cut rounds, so I'm not going to count them here. The only round that does count are the dolphin hot dogs. When Heather tries to pressure Bridget into eating the hot dogs, I feel like Courtney would stand up for Bridget against Heather. Since Bridget and DJ are still here or don't eat the hot dogs and imagine Courtney would eat it, this would lead to the tiebreaker. Owen would still beat LaShawna, making the guys win. The episode would end with the guys going on the cruise and the girls going back to their cabins. Episode 15 would begin with the girls are all mad at each other for the last challenge. The guys, on the other hand, come back from their cruise, are all happy with each other. Chris would then announce the merge. Eva would then come back and be unreasonably mad at Bridget. I think Eva would also be mad at Courtney since she's another female on the base team. In the original, Eva didn't get mad at Jeff, Duncan, or DJ, even though they all voted her off. I assume it's a gender thing with her grudge against Bridget. Izzy would also return swinging on a vine. In this challenge there are a lot of quick cut rounds and a lot of eliminations that just happening, so I can't really go through this challenge. Some notable events is that Jeff would still take Bridget's place in the lake leeches after Eva peer pressures Lindsay. The only new contestant in Courtney, and I don't imagine she'll be as good as LaShawna or Eva, so they'll still be in the final 2. LaShawna would face a log-rolling champion Bear in the final challenge. She'll still win like the original, getting immunity, a trailer, and getting Eva eliminated from the challenge. The elimination would play out the same with Eva voting Heather and everyone else voting Eva. Duncan didn't vote Eva originally because he thought Heather had something to do with Courtney's elimination, so no, he would just vote off Eva. Sorry if this episode won a lot shorter than my other ones. It's just can't really change much about this episode and I don't see much new character interactions. Episode 16 would begin with Jeff and Bridget hanging about at the dock. Heather would notice this and have a confessional saying that her alliance will be the only one and the bond between Bridget and Jeff must be broken. Later, Chris blows up LaShawna's new cabin. The challenge would begin and all the campers that were here originally would get their original keys. The only person that was not here, Courtney. Courtney would get Trent's key that involves getting it from man-eating sharks. Courtney would do the same thing that Trent does, which involves throwing bait where the sharks are to get the key. Duncan would then come over and celebrate with Courtney. It then cuts to Heather, who would get her key in the same way to the original. Then we would see Gwen struggle to get her key from the stunk hole. This would be until Bridget shows up and helps Gwen get the key out. Gwen would thank Bridget and reveal her crush on Trent and how Heather got him eliminated. Bridget would comfort Gwen and offer an alliance. Gwen would be unsure, but Bridget would tell Gwen that this alliance could get Heather out. Gwen would accept and even ask Bridget to add LaShawna to the alliance. We later see Duncan jump through the ring of fire getting his key. Lindsay would then get her key with the help of Izzy. Izzy would then get her key from the snake before Heather calls an alliance meeting. Heather would tell Izzy and Lindsay's that they need to break up Jeff and Bridget. I choose these two because even though they aren't official yet, in episode 14 Brunch of Disgustness, Heather witnessed Jeff helping Bridget despite them being on opposite teams. Even if they aren't a thing yet, they definitely could be soon, and Heather would want to prevent that. The only other couple is Duncan and Courtney, but Heather would realize that Duncan wouldn't believe what Heather would be saying and would kiss her, whilst Jeff is dumb and could fall for it. Gwen and Bridget would find LaShawna on the Crocodile Bridge and try and offer an alliance, but they realize it's not the best time. Heather would then get Lindsay to leave a love note on Bridget's bed. which would tell Bridget to come to the dock at 5. Lindsay would also get Jeff to come out of the skeptic tank and come comfort Heather, who's currently crying on the dock. Jeff would come comfort Heather, then Heather would kiss him in front of Bridget, leading them to both punching the ground out of betrayal and anger. Lashana would then come into the girls' cabin where she sees at crying Bridget. Bridget reveals Heather kissing Jeff, and this leads to Lashana getting everyone to vote for Heather or Jeff. Everyone would then open their chests and Heather would still get immunity like the original. The elimination would play out like the original. Since Heather got immunity, everyone would vote off Jeff. Jeff would be shocked, asking why they all voted for me. Lashana would reveal him kissing Heather. Bridget and Jeff would reconcile, and both realizing that they both got played by Heather. They both share a kiss as Jeff leaves to the dock of shame. The episode would end the same, with Lashana making Heather shower in sewage. Episode 17 would begin with Lashana telling Bridget and to get over Jeff, and the best thing she can do now is get revenge on Heather. Bridget then asks Lashana to join Gwen's and her alliance to get rid of Heather, and Lashana joins their alliance. When the challenge begins, Lindsay would do an awful job at hiding, whilst Lashana will go in the same spot as the original. When Duncan tries to form the guys' alliance like the original, I don't think he will. Since there's only 3 guys now, DJ, Owen and Duncan, so he would look for other options. He would try and form an alliance between the former base members. DJ and Courtney would be in the cave and agree with him. Bridget isn't in the cave, so Duncan would get Courtney to convince her. Courtney would find Bridget with the rope around her ankle, and Courtney would just inform Bridget to get it off. Bridget would thank Courtney, and Courtney would use this to try and get Bridget into the alliance. Bridget is unsure since she's in her own alliance with Gwen and Lashana. After a lot of convincing, Bridget would give in and join. Bridget would then have a confessional stating that she doesn't really work with Duncan, but being in 2 alliances guarantees I'm safe. Lindsay would then try to hide with Heather, which would result in them both being captured. Izzy would still have a fight with Chef, which would also get her captured. Even though Bridget isn't hiding in her original spot, I would still imagine she would get caught pretty quickly. It would then cut to DJ and Owen on top of the kitchen roof. They both see each other and fall of like in the original. Heather finds both of them and gets invisibility for herself without Lindsay getting it, since Heather didn't want her to guess. This was a really bad play in the original by Heather. All did was make her ally prone to elimination and make Lindsay doubt their friendship. Chef would still find Gwen, Courtney and Duncan. I don't imagine Courtney could be capable of finding a good enough hiding spot to be Lashana, so she'll be out, leading to Lashana getting immunity. Before the vote, Bridget would tell Gwen and Lashana about the alliance that Courtney told her. Lashana would ask who in it, and Bridget would reveal Courtney, DJ and Duncan being in it. Lashana states that we could vote against them and maybe get someone else to vote with them. Bridget would agree. Bridget would then ask Gwen to get Owen's vote. Owen would agree since he has no other voting option. When the alliance of Bridget, DJ, Duncan and Courtney come together to decide who to vote of, they decide to vote Gwen for being the biggest treat about immunity. When everyone agrees to vote Gwen, Duncan realizes the uncertainty of Bridget, which could mean that she could flip on the alliance. Duncan would then see Owen, Gwen, Bridget and Lashana talking who to vote out. This makes Duncan realize that there's a separate alliance between them, so Duncan goes up to Heather. Duncan knows that he needs the numbers to send one of them home, and Heather is the only option. Duncan asks Heather to vote with Gwen alongside the rest of her alliance since he knows Heather hates Gwen. Heather would agree in the end. At the vote, the alliance of Gwen, Lashana, Owen and Bridget would all agree to vote Duncan for being the most unpleasant and a big threat. Bridget would also think if she voted out the leader of the alliance would crumble, whilst Heather, Izzy, Duncan, DJ, Courtney and Lindsay would all vote for Gwen. This leads to a 6-4 vote with Gwen getting eliminated. Gwen would be shocked, then Duncan reveals it's nothing personal, but you were the biggest threat and had to go. Gwen would give Bridget and Lashana a hug before leaving. At the start of episode 18, all the campers would be hanging about on the beach. Heather would still be mistreating Lindsay, which would cause more friction in their friendship. In the bike building part of the challenge, Duncan would confront Bridget on why she flipped on the alliance. Bridget tries to defend herself, but to no avail. This altercation would probably cause a Bridget-Duncan rivalry. When the contestants begin building their bikes, Heather would still force Lindsay to steal Chef's motorcycle parts to use on Heather's bike. The alliance of DJ, Duncan and Courtney would be having fun and helping each other build their bikes. Courtney could also help DJ calm down when he's scared to ride a bike. Bridget and Lashana would be helping each other until Izzy offers Lashana a ride on her bike that she eagerly accepts. All the campers that were here in the original would build their bikes the same way. The two new contestants Bridget and Courtney would build functional bikes. Courtney's bike would be similar to Duncan's since he was helping her build it. Bridget's bike would be bad, but it would at least work. At the start of the challenge, the contestants must switch to other contestants' bikes. For simplicity's sake, I'll just have the contestants that were here in the original use each other's bikes. Owen would drive Duncan's bike, Duncan would drive Lindsay's bike, Heather would drive DJ's bike. For everyone else I used a random wheel spinner. Courtney is driving Bridget's bike, DJ would drive Heather's bike, Bridget would drive Courtney's bike, and Lindsay is driving Owen's bike. I imagine Heather would crash because she has to push DJ's bike. I feel like Courtney would crash on Bridget's bike because I don't think Bridget's bike could last for the entire race. Bridget would pass the finish line on Courtney's bike, Lindsay would pass on Owen's bike, Duncan would pass on Lindsay's bike. I imagine that DJ couldn't be able to cross the finish since he's been shown throughout the episode to be terrified of the bikes. Owen would also pass the finish line like he did in the original. This means in the final race would be between Courtney, Duncan, Owen and Lindsay. Owen would wipe out on the landmines like in the original, and Duncan would then crash on the oil slicks. Courtney would see Duncan crash on the oil slicks and try really hard to win immunity but lose to Lindsay, coming in second. Lindsay did incredible in this challenge like in the original, but now she doesn't even have to help Heather, so she'll be even better. Even if Courtney is trying harder, there's no chance she could be able to beat Lindsay. This would lead to Courtney getting unfairly eliminated. Everyone would be shocked and Duncan would be threatening to beat up Chris, but Chris states that rules are rules, so there's nothing he can do. Courtney would be outraged with this, probably saying that she'll get her lawyers to sue Chris and this show. At the dock of shame, Duncan would be genuinely sad to see Courtney go, but Courtney kisses him and tells him win this game for the both of them. At the start of episode 19, when the contestants are watching the scary movie, all the original contestants would react the same as in canon. Bridget wouldn't necessarily be scared of the movie, but she would like the violence in the movie, believing that violence is never the answer. We saw in action that Lindsay gets terrified really easily, so I believe she would be terrified alongside DJ, making them bond a bit. Heather would then slap Lindsay to get home more focused. This would then lead to Lindsay questioning her alliance with Heather and wondering if she even likes her. After they finish watching the movie, they would both see Chef and Chris getting on the boat of losers to get off the island. Owen then discovers Chris's hair gel and the campers would believe that this is real. Heather, like the original, would still go to the showers and Lindsay would tag along. Since Gwen isn't here, I imagine Duncan would take leadership and get the others back to camp. Even if Duncan doesn't care about people as much as Gwen, he still wouldn't want them to die. Owen and Izzy would still make out in the woods, making them still get captured like in the original. Duncan would start discussing the basic survival skills in horror show setting. Don't go off on your own, never go in the woods and never make out in the woods. Chef would go straight to Heather and Lindsay in the shower. Chef would say something like, "There's a sale on mascara for people named Lindsay." This would make Lindsay run straight out of the shower straight into Chef. Lindsay would be terrified, but Chef would capture her and bring her to the tent with Chris in. Heather would notice that Lindsay's gone and start calling her a bunch of awful names. Heather would call Lindsay dumb, stupid, stuff like that. Lindsay would hear all of this on the cameras and have a confessional cussing out Heather and declaring their alliance over. DJ would still need to pee like in the original and bring Bridget with him. DJ would enter the bathroom whilst Chris would still play the ice cream truck music. The ice cream music wouldn't work on Bridget because she's not as dumb as Jeff, but Chef would just scare Bridget, causing her to run off into the woods. DJ would still see Heather applying a face mask. This would make DJ run away and run into the tent. Duncan would then check on Heather to make sure she's alright. Heather would tell Duncan to get lost and he would go back to camp. Heather would then go into the shower and get captured by Chef and brought to the tent. When Heather gets back to the tent, Lindsay would be outraged. She would start screaming the horrible things that Heather said to Lindsay and how she an awful friend and one of the worst people alive. Everyone would be cheering Lindsay on as she finally stood up against Heather. Heather would disband their alliance and be fuming with Lindsay. It would then cut to Lashana, who would be getting brownies like the original. She would be captured just like the original. Chef would then chase after a terrified Bridget alone in the woods. Since in phobia factor her fear was being alone in the woods, Chef would then be able to easily capture her. Duncan would then make a head count, realizing that everyone is gone and no one listened to him. Duncan would then go after the Chef and defeat him just like he did like the original. Duncan would then bring back Chef to the tent. Everyone would celebrate. Then Izzy would point out the real escaped psycho killer with a hook. Everyone would freak out and run to dining hall. They would all see the real psycho killer with a hook, but Lindsay, with all her pent-up frustration, would charge at the psycho killer, beating him up really badly. The psycho killer would then run off terrified on Lindsay. Everyone would be a bit scared of this Lindsay, and even Duncan. At the vote, Lindsay would be granted immunity for beating up the real psycho killer. Chris would then say that DJ is walking the dock of shame because he bolted without even seeing Chef. Everyone would be sad to see DJ go and everyone would give him a hug. Episode 20 would begin with Lindsay and Heather having an argument. Everyone else though seems sick of them by now. Bridget has a confessional stating that they were arguing all night, that she could barely get any sleep. Everyone would then go to the dining room where Chris would explain the challenge. When the campers choose their animals, I gave the same animals to the contestants here originally. Owen gets a chipmunk, Duncan with a raccoon, Lashana gets a frog, Heather gets a bear, and Izzy gets a deer. For Bridget and Lindsay, I used a random wheel spinner, and Bridget gets a duck and Lindsay a beaver. At the start of the challenge, I believe that Duncan would still want to make an alliance with Heather. It makes more sense in this universe since Duncan has no allies left, and in the original he still had an alliance with Jeff and Owen. This challenge would mostly play out the same. I imagine Bridget doing really well in this challenge because she's really good with animals. I imagine Lindsay would be having a hard time with the beavers since they seemed really hard to catch in the original. Lindsay would eventually give up and run into Bridget. Bridget would ask Lindsay why she seemed so angry all of a sudden. Lindsay would then go on a rant about Heather, saying how she's the worst person to ever exist. Bridget would respond saying that her recent attitude towards Heather is making her look worse than Heather. Lindsay would take a moment to process this and realize Bridget's right, and Lindsay would thank Bridget. Bridget would then ask if she wants to join hers and Lashana's alliance. Lindsay would agree and join if only they vote out Heather the first chance they get, which Lindsay would agree to. Duncan would finish first now since Gwen isn't here. Duncan would then help Heather with the bear. Bridget would probably come in second since she's good with animals. Lindsay would then finish third. Lashana would then finish fourth a bit later. Izzy, like the original, would shoot Heather because she thought she saw a deer. For some reason in the original, Chris just counts Izzy catching a deer even though she only shot Heather, so that still happens here. Owen would then get his squirrel in the cage as well. If Duncan is still helping Heather with the bear, that means his reward is unintended. I imagine that Owen would just eat all of Duncan's reward. In the original there was no immunity given to the winner because Gwen still places in the bottom two despite winning. This means that Duncan doesn't get immunity. Before the vote, I think the alliance of Lindsay, Bridget and Lashana would discuss who to vote off. Lindsay would suggest Heather, which Bridget would agree to. Lashana would suggest Izzy. Though, since she was shown to be extremely dangerous at the last challenge and Izzy has been harassing Lashana for a long time, Bridget would admit that's a fair point, but she's set on voting Heather because of her and Lindsay's deal. Lashana would agree and alliance would vote their separate ways. Duncan and Heather would agree to vote Izzy since Izzy shot Heather with a tranquilizer dart. Izzy would vote Heather because she knows she is a lot of trouble for shooting Heather, so she would try voting of the most disliked person to save herself. This means 3 votes for Heather and 3 votes for Izzy. This would lead Owen as the swing vote. It would seem obvious that he would Heather, but keep in mind he tried to apologize to Izzy and Izzy denied his apology. Also, Owen ate Duncan's reward, so Duncan could use this against him to vote Izzy. Duncan would go up to Owen and get him to vote Izzy. At the vote, Izzy would be voted out 4-3 with Lashana, Duncan, Heather and Owen voting her out with the rest voting Heather. Owen would be very apologetic to Izzy, and Izzy would eventually forgive Owen before leaving on the dock of shame. Episode 21 would begin where Owen would be having 10 dream about cheese. Later Chris would explain the challenge where all 6 contestants would have separate confessionals about the final 6. The pairs in the original seem to be dysfunctional as possible, so I'll try to recreate it here. Heather and Lindsay. They hated each other ever since episode 19. Bridget and Duncan. Their personalities clash a lot here and they'd had a rivalry since episode 17. Owen and Lashana. They don't really have beef, they're just the only 2 left. In the first portion of the challenge, which is an eating challenge, I believe that Owen would eat for his duo. Lindsay would force Heather to be the eater. And Duncan would be the eater for the Bridget-Duncan pair, since Bridget a vegetarian and they had to eat chicken. I imagine that Owen and Lashana would, since Lindsay would be too aggressive with ceasing Heather and Duncan can't eat that quickly. In the next part of the challenge, where the campers must take a canoe to Boney Island. When Duncan demands to go at the front off the canoe, Bridget would just let him because she doesn't want to fight about it. Heather and Lindsay would just be arguing. Heather would tell Lindsay that they hate each other but they have to win, so they're not at risk of elimination. Lindsay would agree if only Heather apologizes, which Heather ultimately does. Bridget would ask Duncan why he feels the need to be mean all the time. Duncan would just respond that Juvie isn't a place for kindness. Bridget would tell him that he's no longer at Juvie and shouldn't feel the need to appear tough. Duncan would be about to make a counter-argument until Bridget would bring up the bunny that Duncan recused for DJ. Courtney didn't tell Bridget in the original, but since Courtney's been here for longer, and if she told Lashana, I would think that she would tell Bridget, who she's much closer to. Duncan would tell the story of how he lost his dog and didn't want DJ to have to go through the same fate as him. Bridget would tell him that he did a good thing for his friend and he should do this more often. Duncan would thank Bridget. Lashana and Owens would be getting on just fine. When the campers drive at Boney Island to return the tiki doll, I imagine that Bridget would get on Duncan's back, Lashana on Owens and Lindsay on Heather's back. Heather is probably stronger compared to Lindsay. Bridget and Duncan would arrive first, since in the original Owen arrived first, but he was carrying Heather, who's a lot lighter than Lashana. Duncan and Bridget would get there first, but would then get scared of by the woolly beavers. Owen's pair and Heather's pair would arrive at a similar time, but Heather would be crafty enough to throw the tiki doll in before Owen and Lashana make it to the cave. This would mean that Heather and Lindsay would win. This means that it's 1 for Owen's duo and 1 for Lindsay's duo. In the next part of the challenge, the totem pole stacking. Lindsay and Heather would be working together until Heather would see Beth Wood's carving and comment on how she was such a spineless girl. Lindsay would tell Heather to shut up and they would get into a fight. When Chris shows Courtney with a heart in the back of her head, Bridget would comment how cute that is before throwing a piece of wood at Chris. This comment would make Duncan laugh and he would thank Bridget. Lindsay and Heather would do awful in this challenge since they're both fighting. Lashana was part of the winning pair with Duncan, but now that she with Owen, I doubt they would win. They both were on the Gophers team and Owen would be distracted by Justin's carving. Duncan and Bridget would probably win because Duncan won originally and Bridget is a very social bull and nice person, so I think she would remember a lot of contestants. This would mean that Bridget and Duncan would win, so that anyone can be voted off. For the vote, it's a bit confusing since in the original the most likable person was targeted for being a jury threat. The same logic would apply here then for Owen. Jeff got voted out in the original and I think that Owen is even more likable than Jeff. Heather would tell Bridget and Lashana to vote for Owen alongside her and Duncan. Bridget and Lashana would be hesitant, but Heather would bring up that she is no threat come a jury vote and Owen is. This would then convince them both. In a 4-2 vote with Lindsay and Owen voting Heather, Owen would be eliminated. Owen would be quite sad, but he would mostly take it well and he would thank everyone for the wild experience. I originally didn't know how to cover this episode, so I'm just going to go through what the campers would be thinking about at the resort before going into the elimination. Trent and Gwen would have been here for quite some time and probably get to be an official couple. Jeff would be having a good time, but he would hope that Bridget would forgive him even though he kissed Heather. Tyler would be rooting for Lindsay to win and hope they could get together after the competition. Harold wouldn't be trying to hide away from Courtney like the original and would just be reading or something. Courtney would be really enthusiastic about Duncan winning because they lasted even longer as a couple. Owen would be bonding with Izzy and Eva. Now getting into the vote would be between Lindsay, Lashana or Bridget, since for some reason in the original they voted off a really likable person, Lashana, and kept a really dislikable person in, Heather. The vote is pretty much up to Katie and Sadie since they're the ones who started the Lashana train like the original. I decided to rule out Bridget because she vomited on them in episode 5 and I imagine they would still be pretty mad about that, so it's between Lindsay and Lashana, and I think Lashana goes. Sadie and Katie would have definitely picked Lindsay because their personality goes better with Lindsay's, but because Lindsay been so aggressive to Heather from episode 19 to this one, when Lashana was aggressive with Heather she did it to stand up for herself, but Lindsay was just blatantly being mean to Heather. This would then lead to the train off people saying Lashana until she gets enough votes to be eliminated. Lashana would get on the dock just like in the original and get eliminated. It's unfair I know, but it happened in canon. Episode 23 would begin and the campers would sitting underneath the cabin's roofs. Bridget would be in the confessional expressing how unfair Lashana's elimination was. The cabins would later drift downstream and the campers would be in the beach. Duncan would want to stay put, but Lindsay would take over Gwen's by stating that they need to build a raft. Heather would go to the treehouse like in the original. Bridget would get out of the confessional at this point and try to find the rest of the contestants. Bridget at this point would find the other campers and see them fighting. Bridget would probably go with Duncan since she would probably agree with Duncan that the producers would send a help party. At this point Lindsay would be starving and allow Bridget and Duncan to come on her raft whilst Heather stays in the treehouse. Lindsay, Duncan and Bridget would come across the prehistoric goose and get swept upwards. Owen isn't here to scare Heather, so she'd still just be inside the cabin. The goose would then drop Lindsay, Duncan and Bridget and they would reunite with Heather. A snake would then land on the campers and they would all run into the treehouse. In the tree's house, all the campers would then start expressing their sins. The campers would then all run back to Chef 2 and Chris. In the original Owen found Mr. Coconut and he was eliminated. But now since no one has Mr. Coconut someone should get eliminated. I'm still going to make this a non-elimination, since this challenge is barely even a challenge. All the campers do is find Chris and Chef, no one even gets immunity, so I'm keeping this one a non-elimination. Sorry if this episode is short, I just don't see anything changing on any new character interactions. Episode 24 would begin with the campers asleep in the woods. Chef would then explain the challenge and the campers would be put in teams off twos. I put Bridget and Heather together since she's already been with Duncan in episode 21 and she gets along with Lindsay too well, so I doubt that the producers would like that. Heather is still in an alliance with Duncan and has already been with Lindsay also in episode 21, plus Duncan and Lindsay have barely interacted, so it would be nice to some interactions. Bridget and Heather would take an early lead because Duncan went the wrong way like in the original and I don't see how that would change even if Lindsay is his partner. Whilst walking, Heather would have a similar talk that she did to Bridget, that they have to win no matter what. Bridget would agree but wouldn't want to play dirty. Lindsay and Duncan would then be on the raft and take a lead over Bridget and Heather. Lindsay and Duncan would also have a conversation. Duncan would bring up that Lindsay's been Heather pawn for most of the season and ask why. Lindsay would respond that she thought they were friends and thought Heather was always right. Duncan would then bring up that Lindsay is quite good on her own, and he would bring up the bike race in episode 18. Lindsay would thank Duncan, and Duncan would just tell her that to prove that she doesn't need Heather, she could beat her in this challenge. They would high-five as they would continue with the challenge. The montage of the contestants stealing each other's supplies would still happen, and I believe that Duncan and Lindsay would get the supplies, since Duncan's a criminal and got the supplies in the original. The Sasquatch encounter would then happen, leading all the contestants being together. When Bridget and Heather asked to sleep with Duncan and Lindsay, Lindsay would be very hesitant because of Heather. But since her friend Bridget is there, I do imagine she would let them sleep with them. Lindsay would tell Duncan to not get manipulated by Heather and be wary of her. Lindsay would follow up by telling him that they're leaving camp as soon as they can. When Heather would try and flirt with Duncan, but Lindsay would tell her off, calling her an awful human being for trying to mess with someone's feelings. Heather would be about to respond, but Lindsay would just raise her fist at Heather, causing her to back off. Bridget would then have a confessional about how proud of Lindsay she is, but a bit scared by her new attitude. When the campers wake up at around the same time, I imagine it would just be a foot race to the end. I do think Bridget and Heather could run faster than Duncan and Lindsay, but I don't think that they would get to finish line before them, because in this universe Heather never got the map off Duncan after flirting with him. Duncan still has the map, so I do think they could get to the finish line first, and Lindsay definitely won't eat the sticky buns like Owen. This means that Lindsay and Duncan would have immunity. Now for the vote. The vote is a bit weird because the campers don't decide the vote, Chef does, and it's between Bridget and Heather. Chef would like Heather's personality more, but I do believe that Chef would generally started getting annoyed by Heather, and in episode 16 Heather stole the key from Chef's fridge. In Revenge of the Island it is revealed that he hates when people touch his stuff, and with Bridget Chef doesn't have a reason to dislike her, but I do believe that he would think that she too nice. After all of this I do think that Heather would get eliminated by Chef. Heather would be angry and start cussing out Chef and all the other campers, but everyone just wouldn't care. Duncan would tell Heather that she underestimated Lindsay, and Lindsay got her eliminated. Lindsay would smile at Heather, and in the end I do think that Heather would accept that she did underestimate Lindsay and she isn't actually dim-witted or stupid. Heather would leave on the boat of losers and Lindsay would be ecstatic. Episode 25 would begin with all the campers eating pancakes for breakfast. All the campers would happy since there's no animosity between them. Heather's also gone, so they would all be relieved. Chris would then announce the challenge. Now this challenge changes a lot and I can't really go through it. Owen isn't here, so they can't be in dares revolving around him. Additionally, I can't have any clue what Heather's, Gwen's, and Owen's dares would be. Also Lindsay dare isn't there anymore, so no one would go bald. There isn't a powerhouse like Owen here to take all the dares either. I don't believe anyone more team up with someone else, since there's no really irritating person that everyone hates and they're all relatively friendly. I decided that Duncan would be doing the best in this challenge, just because I think he has the best pain tolerance, and would be the most willing to do disgusting stuff. I do think that Bridget would be doing alright, since there's no challenge requiring to eat meat. Lindsay would also be doing okay, and the challenge of Chef shaving your head isn't there anymore. This was really hard to decide between Lindsay and Bridget. But I ultimately decided that it would be Lindsay that would lose. Even though she would be motivated to prove to Heather, she's still Lindsay. She has the weakest stomach and is definitely the most uncoordinated out of the rest. Lindsay would probably get a dare where she has to balance on something and would lose. When Lindsay would lose she would be sad, but Bridget would say that she still proved a point to Heather and should be proud of her accomplishment. Lindsay would get and the dock of shame, relatively happy with her performance in the game. The final two would then be between Duncan and Bridget. The final episode would begin with the campers giving their thoughts in the confessional. Bridget would explain how excited she is to be in the finale. She then goes on to explain the incredible friends she made along the way. Duncan would express that he happy to made it as far as he can, since it means that he could be out of juvie the longest. Duncan would also express how meeting Courtney was one of the best things that ever happened to him. When Bridget and Duncan tell the peanut gallery what they would do with the money, Bridget would probably save it for school and maybe save a bit to bring some of friends she's made here to the beach for a surfing vacation. Duncan would explain how he could use the money to bail out of juvie and maybe save a bit for him and Courtney. When the peanut gallery picked their team, I decided for this. On Team Bridget it would be Lashana, Lindsay and Gwen. They were all friends with Bridget throughout the game. Jeff would be there because he still has a crush on Bridget, Trent because he would probably like Bridget more and he's been shown to hate Duncan in later seasons, Harold because he hates Duncan, Sadie and Katie have been shown to get along with Bridget on the base, Beth probably because Bridget's a nice girl which Beth would like, Noah would be here because I don't think he would like Duncan, Cody because Gwen's on Team Bridget, and Tyler because I believe that he would like Bridget's less aggressive personality more. On Team Duncan, Heather would be there because she would like the more strategic approach Duncan took on the game. Owen and DJ, they're both guys and got along with Duncan in the merge and pre-merge. Eva because she hated Bridget, Justin because he got on well with Duncan in action and would probably like his gameplay more, Izzy because Duncan mentioned that he was using the money to get out of juvie, which Izzy would find funny. And Ezekiel because man and woman, it's pretty obvious that he would choose the man's side. Finally, Courtney because they're going out. Unlike the original, Heather wouldn't give either camper a muffin with laxatives in, since she doesn't despise the two finalists and just would care enough to do anything. In the first bit of the challenge where the contestants must climb a pole to retrieve a flag, I imagine Duncan would grab it quite easily with the help of Courtney. Bridget would struggle a bit, but with Jeff's help she could probably do it. Bridget by now probably would have forgiven Jeff since she can't hold grudges for more than 6 minutes. This would give Duncan a slight lead over Bridget. At the next portion of the challenge where the campers must cross a bridge holding eagle eggs, Courtney would wildly rooting for Duncan. Duncan would get halfway across the bridge before Bridget shows up. Duncan would get another slight lead for the race back to the finish line, with Bridget barely trailing behind. Since Jeff and Courtney have been running with their respective partners and Jeff would have been cheering Bridget on the entire time, Courtney would want Duncan to win really badly, so she would tackle Jeff to the ground. Courtney does this to try and slow Bridget down, so Duncan could easily win. Bridget just carries on with the race and the alternative endings are shown here. In Bridget's ending, Duncan takes a moment to laugh at Jeff whilst Courtney's attacking him, allowing Bridget to overtake him. In Duncan's ending, Duncan doesn't stop to laugh at Jeff and runs straight to the finish line. In Bridget's ending, Jeff runs up to her hugging her and saying how she's the best girl ever. Duncan would come up to her and congratulate her before fist bumping her. In Duncan's ending, Duncan would celebrate wildly, expressing how happy he is to finally get out of juvie. Courtney would run up to him and kiss him very aggressively. The episode would end with Duncan, Jeff and Owen throwing Chris into the water. For my first what if, I think I did an okay job. Harold rigging the votes against Courtney was a very major plot point in Island, and seeing how much it's changed the game is interesting. I do like how this what if turned out. Seeing Courtney's and Duncan's relationship expand further was fun to do. I also enjoyed how Lindsay realized that Heather hated her in the episode where she wasn't eliminated. I would have wanted Lindsay to make the finale, but I just wouldn't have seen it happening. Heather getting eliminated in episode 24 was a bit lame, but it did expand upon Lindsay's arc. The two finalists were quite good. Island is both Bridget and Duncan's best seasons, and seeing them win is quite rewarding. Thanks for watching this video. If this video does well, I would definitely consider making more like this. Comment below what ifs I should do next, and bye.